All right, so we're calling this generally the character of the kingdom. This is Mark painting a picture of the kingdom, drawing his material from events that took place in the life of Christ, presumably reported to him by Peter, as we've said, massaged a bit by Mark. Certainly he has an agenda, but true to the events of history, nevertheless reporting them in a way that's intended to be educational to us. I don't know if you recall when Jim Edwards was here, I loved his presentation. He made a little comment in passing that I thought was so helpful. He said Mark really invented a new literary genre, the genre of gospel. And that's kind of what we've been saying all along. Mark is doing something here. He's reporting history with a certain design, a certain purpose. And his purpose at this point seems to be to give us a picture of the kingdom using these stories as his stock and trade for getting the job done. So we've looked at the kingdom as a place of suffering followed by glory. We've looked at the kingdom as a place of humility leading to service. And now this morning we're looking at the third of these angles on the kingdom, again introduced by this prediction of the passion. And I'm calling this, what does an ideal citizen in the kingdom look like? And Mark tells the story this way. They were on the road going to Jerusalem. Jesus is going before them. They were amazed. They were afraid. So he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. We learn otherwise they're on what's called the Jericho Road. The Jericho Road was a famous road. It plays prominently in the parable of the Good Samaritan, you know. So it's about 17 miles distance from Jerusalem. They've come through Perea, crossed back across to the western side of the Jordan River, and now they're heading through Jericho up to Jerusalem. Jesus seems to be going there with a kind of grim determination. We get this sense that the closer he gets, the more it is just a matter of heading into this crucible that awaits him there in Jerusalem. Luke is the one who tells us he set his face as a flint to go into Jerusalem. The disciples, probably sensing that something is waiting for them there that is going to be traumatic to say the least, Mark tells us that they're amazed, they're afraid, probably sensing something of what's in the air here, uncertain about what exactly it's going to look like. And Jesus is not going to lead them astray. He's not going to give them a false impression of the very difficult expectations that are there. So he takes them aside again and gives them this third prediction. This is the third time now that Jesus has predicted the coming passion. I'm not going to go through all these. We went through them in detail before. I just want you to note that the third of the three gives us a little more detail. It's here that Jesus says they will condemn him to death. They will deliver him to the Gentiles. They'll mock him. They'll scourge him. They'll spit on him. No false pretense, no bait and switch, no idea in which the disciples weren't fully apprised of what was awaiting them there. And so their fear, their anxiety was probably justified, at least in the sense that this is what Jesus told them to expect. And yet certainly Jesus is not going to be anybody's victim. Jerusalem is happening by a great design for a great purpose, but it ain't going to be an easy road, you know, and so that's kind of the general sense of what's happening. Well, interestingly, James and John, in spite of this prediction of the passion, are nevertheless trying to see through it to the glory that's got to be on the other side, you know. And so they come with a very modest request. Sons of Zebedee came forward to Jesus and said, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask." I mean, who can argue with that, you know? Kind of a prior commitment. Whatever we put on the table, you just agree in advance, sight unseen, to do it. Jesus doesn't just chuckle and walk away. He actually entertains it. Well, what is it you want me to do for you? They said, well, we'd like you to grant to us to sit one at your right hand, one at your left hand, in your glory. Jesus said to them, you guys don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? They replied, you betcha, we are able. Then Jesus said to them, well, look, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And the baptism that I'm facing, you'll be baptized as well. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant. It is for those for whom it has been prepared. So here is bad example number one of the ideal citizen. This is not what it looks like, and in a sense, Mark wants us to see this to set up the contrast with the simplicity and elegance of blind Bartimaeus, who we'll get to a little bit later. Well, James and John, sons of Zebedee, come, make this extravagant request. They are, of course, part of the inner circle. Matthew, interestingly, says that it was actually their mother, Salome. You can imagine this daughter of Israel, two sons in tow, bringing them to Jesus. Can't you just see this in your mind? And she's making the request. Mark isn't so interested in protecting their reputation, so he leaves Salome out of it and just leaves it in their care as well. But the one thing that really does interest us here is that they exclude Peter. They're part of the inner three, Peter, James, and John, and somehow Peter didn't make the cut. And so James and John, maybe a little bit of an end run, maybe trying to, crowd out Peter a little bit, who knows, come and make this request. Mark has generally been understood as Peter's memoirs, and so Peter may have a pretty vivid recollection of this particular moment when they were trying to squeeze him out. But one way or another, they come and they ask Jesus for a blank check. We'd like you to do whatever we ask of you. Maybe they still remember what they heard last week when Jesus said, anyone who leaves houses, brothers, sisters, lands, etc., will get it all back 100-fold in this world, let alone eternity. They dug that action. They said, so maybe we should cash in on that right now and come and ask for a little bit of that 100-fold. Chrysostom says we should be giving them a little bit more of a break. I'm being kind of hard on them myself, but Chrysostom warns, quote, the mystery of the cross was not yet accomplished, nor yet was the grace of the Holy Spirit poured into their hearts. Wherefore, if you desire to know the strength of their faith, consider what they became after they had been endued with power from on high. So before we're too hard on them, we'll recognize that this is still pre-events of the gospel, and we'll just give them a little bit of slack for that. Jesus asks them the question, what do you want me to do for you? This is intentional. These words have been asked by Jesus on many occasions. In fact, virtually any time a healing takes place, Jesus will ask the question, what do you want me to do for you? But especially in this context, we're going to see he'll ask the very same question to blind Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? What we're supposed to notice is the difference in the response when he asks these disciples, James and John, the question, as opposed to what he gets from Bartimaeus when he puts the question to him. It got me thinking this past week, how would I answer the question? I always, as a kid, loved the story about genie and the bottle, and you rub it, and the genie comes out and says, you got 3 requests, and how we play that little what-if game. What would I ask if the God of heaven and earth asked me, what do you want? What would I say? I have a feeling that a truthful answer is a pretty good gauge of our character. You find people throughout the Scriptures are given an opportunity to respond to such a question, and with varying degrees of depth of quality and understanding do we hear their answers. There's one character Simon Magus. He was in Samaria. He was supposedly a great man, but when he saw Peter, who was able to deliver, it appeared to the Holy Spirit by his mere touch of a hand, Simon Magus thought, boy, I'd love to do that, and he offered Peter money to have that same power. The Greek is hardly ever translated as brutally as it should be. What it actually says, pretty much, is that Peter's response to Simon Magus, you and your money can go to hell. That's how strong is the language. It shook Simon Magus right to the core, and his response was, quote, "Pray to the Lord for me, that none of the things you've spoken may come upon me." Not exactly a prayer of repentance, Not exactly a prayer of deep remorse. It is a prayer of trying to escape the consequences of my bad acts. And sometimes that's what people want. They just want to escape the bad effects of what they've done. Then you think about a Solomon. God asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Solomon famously responds, of course, "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Much better answer, much deeper understanding of things. I suppose if the question were put to us on our best days, we should answer something related to what Jesus gives us as priority number one for citizens of the kingdom, namely, seek first the kingdom of God, with the promise that as we let go of things for the sake of the kingdom, He will add them back. All of these things, houses, brothers, sisters, lands, all of this will be added back, but only as we have put in the very first position of our priorities the kingdom itself. Well, the disciples may have actually thought they were doing that because they ask for positions in the kingdom, Grant that we may sit, one at your right hand, one at your left, in your glory. That's all they want. They might say, "Hey, we're seeking first the kingdom. That's what we have in mind here. And we want to be right at the very prominent positions in this kingdom that's coming along." Maybe not exactly what Jesus had in mind. Interestingly, the honor they're seeking, you might argue, was actually given to Peter, who was bypassed by them. Matthew tells us at Caesarea Philippi that Jesus said to Peter, and it's the singular pronoun here, "To you, Peter," singular, the Greek word su, "to you I give the keys of the kingdom." Not to James, not to John, but to you. And we see Peter has, in some peculiar sense, this unique status. If anyone wound up sitting at the right hand, you might say, it was Peter. It was Peter who preached the word that opened the doors of the kingdom on the day of Pentecost, and 3,000 people came pouring in. It was Peter who stood up before the Sanhedrin for the first time and gave testimony to the work of Christ, in a sense, using the keys of the kingdom. It was Peter who went to Samaria and opened the door of the kingdom to these half-Jewish Samaritan people, saying the gospel is for you as well. It was Peter who opened the doors of the kingdom with those keys to Gentiles in the home of Cornelius when he preached the gospel and gave this testimony of the Holy Spirit coming, as it had to them on the day of Pentecost. So who was going to withhold baptism? Again and again, opening the doors of the kingdom to a wider and wider swath of humanity till it finally reached us, you see. And so in some ways it's Peter who got what these two guys were asking for, though they didn't have a clue that that's what they were asking for. But there was some sense in which something legitimate may have actually been at least implied in it. They, for their part, were intoxicated, one commentator said, with a vision of glory that they barely grasped. And Jesus tries to give them a little heads up in that connection. You don't know what you ask for. Do you really think you're able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm facing? You don't know what you're asking for. Most of us don't in prayer. My favorite verse in the Bible, I've told you before, is in Romans chapter 8. We don't know how to pray as we ought to pray. I always want to say to God, you got that right. I feel like I grope in the darkness of wandering mind, just like a slug when it comes to praying. We don't know how to pray as we ought to pray, and if it were just my own assessment of my own ability to pray, I think I would despair immediately. But I like the rest of that verse. The Holy Spirit helps us That English word is 5 letters long. The Greek word is sonanti lambonatai. It's a rich word. It's got a whole lot of stuff going on that doesn't quite come over in translation. Steps in, shoulders our burden, steps in on behalf of us, utters this prayer for us in an elegantly perfect way. The only way, one commentator said, we could pray a perfect prayer would be if we had perfect knowledge. We're always praying in a bit of confusion. But the fact that we're promised that prayers sincerely offered, regardless of how misguided or naive they may be, are nevertheless transformed by God's Spirit, gives us assurance that no prayer is ever wasted, ever. We may be surprised sometime in eternity to say how a prayer we prayed was answered, because we didn't really have that in mind. But that prayer was never lost will never be lost on us, as we see how God works through the prayers of His people. So even these guys, as much as we might think they're a little off base here, are still doing the right thing, making this request, as misguided as it may seem to be. Well, Jesus gives them a warning. Are you able to drink the cup? In the Scriptures, the cup tends to stand for that unique lot or portion that God has peculiarly prepared for any given person because of that person's unique circumstance. The same principle applies even in pagan literature in the ancient world. The cup that's given by the gods to people because of their peculiar circumstance. It was a very widely understood image or metaphor. It came from an ancient practice in which kings would sometimes invite over special guests and actually mix for each one of them a peculiar recipe of wine that was especially intended for that person because of their life situation or what the king may otherwise know about him or the counselors might inform him of. And so there was this idea of a cup that was especially and distinctly formulated for an individual person. Jesus refers to being baptized, a kind of baptism of fire, we assume that he has in mind as he heads for Jerusalem and faces the crucible that's there. Are you able to do this? Can you drink my cup? Can you go through my baptism? Jesus asks. And they answer, no problem. We're able. And Jesus says, well, as a matter of fact, you will drink the cup that I drink, in some sense. You will go through this baptism. This probably would have been better answered something like, we are not able, give us grace, something like that. There is a tendency we have, James and John seem to reflect it, of confusing bravado, optimism, overconfidence with faith. In American history, we've had 2 great events that are commonly called Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening took place in the mid-1700s. It was under the rich, deep, theologically informed preaching of people like Jonathan Edwards, of George Whitefield, and others. And those sermons, their content was deeply embedded in the truth of Scripture. These were not just pep rallies. These were profound and deeply engaging sermons. Then there was another that came about 100 years later that's called the Second Great Awakening. The principal characters there were people like Charles Finney and others. They were called revivalists. And it gave rise in American history to the revivalist tradition, which has been very important in evangelical tradition in America. And it operates, not that it's all bad, but it does have a kind of principle in its heart that faith is supposed to be whipped up by a kind of emotional frenzy. And so you have all kinds of hymns, revive us again, we need revival around here. We need to get juiced up again. And there's an idea that if I just get an emotional head of steam going, a kind of momentum that I feel that it's going to carry me through life. And there's a confusion between that and faith. Faith is not that. Faith is not just a head of steam. It's not just an emotional frenzy. It is something else. And when the only sort of depth of experience or worship is just kind of ginning up some new emotions, we're sort of missing the point. It does give us this feeling we are able, for sure, But it may not last very long. James and John certainly felt able at this point, but they, along with the other disciples, abandoned Jesus when the heat in the kitchen got a little too high. They were the ones, you see, who were running for cover. They felt like they could endure this baptism, but when it really came down to it, they weren't able to, because it was something different that was necessary than just this sense of emotional steam. Jesus says, well, you guys are going to drink this cup. Surprisingly enough, you are going to share this baptism. Interestingly, James and John represent the disciple who died first and the disciple who died last. They're the bookends. James was the first disciple, apostle, to be martyred under the rule of Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great. It would take place in about 15 years from the moment that they were having this conversation. We hear about that in Acts chapter 12. John outlived all of them. There is a tradition that he was indeed forced to drink a cup of poison. Therefore, sometimes the artwork that portrays John the apostle shows him with this cup, because it is at least traditional that he was forced to do that, but he was unharmed by it. There's also a tradition reported to us by Tertullian, writing in about the year 180, so it'd be about 80 years after the event, that Domitian, the emperor in Rome in the late 1st century, in his brief but very fierce persecution of Christians, threw John into a cauldron of burning oil, which John survived. So it may very well be that John both drank the cup and was baptized, you see, with fire. I'm saying both of those are traditional. I'm not saying they're in the Bible or necessarily there's complete veracity on that or so on, but certainly the evidence is there that something like that may have occurred. So it's an interesting little piece of history in connection with this. One way or another, all of us who are Christians are called by Christ, so says Paul, to fill up that which is left of the sufferings of Christ. We don't supplement the atoning work of Christ. It's a once-for-all event. Hapags is the Greek word. Once for all, definitive, final, end of it. But there is a growth in the kingdom that takes place over time, and we, as we participate in that growth of the kingdom, may share in filling up and completing the sufferings that are begun by Christ even there in the 1st century. So Jesus says, yeah, you may be onto something. You may, in fact, share something of this suffering. You may drink this cup. You may be baptized. But look, either way, it's not mine to give you the right to sit on my right hand or on my left. That's only for those for whom it is prepared. I've read some commentators, especially critical commentators, who take this as one little piece of evidence that they find that Jesus is disclaiming deity. An Arian view of Christ. He's an idealized man, not God. These are rights he doesn't have. It's above his pay scale. He can't do this. This is not mine to give. I think that misses the point of this text. Of course, I'm biased in favor, I grant, of traditional Trinitarian theology, so I'll just, admit guilt right off the bat at that point. But it seems to me the force of what Jesus is saying here is not so much disclaiming his own status or his own deity even, but rather simply to say that politicking, that lobbying, that jockeying for position with the human Jesus as he's heading for Jerusalem is not the right way to gain prestige in the kingdom. It's not mine to give in that setting. It's not just coming off and trying to make a persuasive speech that's going to get you into some sort of status position in the kingdom. That's not the way it works. It's for those for whom it is prepared. God's sovereign purposes are at work, stationing us in the kingdom in whatever role God has called us to. And for us to start trying to maneuver in this way is simply, illegitimate. And in that sense, Jesus can say, it's not mine to give. This is not the way this thing works. It's for those for whom it is prepared, based on God's purpose, a purpose that will never be thwarted, nor fully deciphered beforehand. So there's strike one. James and John wanting prestige in the kingdom, Sorry, guys, that's not the way it works. Strike two, the rest of the disciples heard of this, and they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, look, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them, but it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Notice these are themes we've seen before. This section is intended to remind us and sort of put a final touch on themes that have been developed in these prior stories. And here we don't see anything we haven't, at least in some sense, encountered before. Beginning with the 10 who are greatly displeased, indignant. Same word was used to describe Jesus when they were trying to keep children from coming to him. He was greatly displeased. But in this case, it seems that their great displeasure may have been a little bit misguided. We don't know how they heard it. That they heard it, that is the point. And their displeasure seems to be not so much based on some kind of deep righteous sense that this was not a good thing that James and John had done, but more an expression of their fear that they were being outmaneuvered in this politicking that was going on, and James and John are trying to get on the inside track in some way that they didn't like. It does seem that the attitude of the 10 is not much better, in other words, than the attitude of the two, and that's why Jesus calls all of them to himself and says to them, look, guys, you got to get something straight. There is politics in this world, and then there is the kingdom. You know that those who are considered rulers among the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. That's the way this world operates. Political authority is taken for granted in the Bible. It is kind of viewed as sort of a necessary evil. If we were all angels, we wouldn't need government. James Madison told us that. That's pretty solid theology. We're not angels. We're more devils than angels, and so we need government, and that government needs to have coercive authority, and God knows that. And so in his grace, he's given us these restraints. And the Bible takes that for granted and indeed views that as a gift from God that gives us an ordered society in spite of our negative impulses. And Jesus says, hey, that's the way it is in this world. That's the nature of the authority in this world. They lord it over them. That word is the word, I've got to take a run at this, kata kyrioususen, or something like that. Those multisyllabic words do get me in Greek, but anyway, something like that. And the heart of the word is kata, preposition that means down. Kyrios is the heart of the word, which means lord. Lording it down or lording it over is pretty much exactly what it means. It suggests coercive power, or what Paul otherwise calls in Romans 13, the sword. He doesn't bear the sword in vain. The civil magistrate has the power to force obedience if necessary. The other word is a little bit more textured. It's the word kat exousia zousen. Another word that uses kata, down, and the heart of this word is exousia, which is the word for authority, as in the authority of dignity. Governmental authority is a strange mix of authority or even majesty at the same time bearing the sword. It has both weapons at its disposal. That's why Paul tells us in Romans 13, you should be subject not only because of wrath, that is the sword, but also because of conscience, because actually government is in some sense a reflection of God's authority among us. There's a legitimacy to political authority, we all understand that, and yet Jesus' point here is that my kingdom is not of this world. It's not made of the same stuff as authority in this world. It is a kind of different thing, and it works in a different way. It's not going to be this way among you. If you want to be great in the kingdom, you approach things differently than if you're running for political office. It's not the same thing. If you want to be great in the kingdom, then it means you're going to seek not to be served, but to serve. And the first word Jesus uses here for that is the word diakonos, from which we get the word deacon. To be a deacon in the ancient world would be something like a household servant, but not necessarily a slave. Something like a butler, you might say. It could be a prestigious position, but it was nevertheless a position of service. This idea was picked up, as I mentioned to you some weeks back, in Western history, in the notion of the prime minister, literally the prime deacon. The Christian influence began to change political vision a little bit, so that the leaders of countries began to style themselves as the chief servant, not the ruler to be served, but the chief server. You see, that's a Christian influence there that's already beginning to be seen in the early centuries of the church. But Jesus even pushes it further. Whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave. This is a stronger word. This is the word doulos. Did I do that? So far, so good? All right. This is the word doulos. This is the word for slave. This is to say a person who is a simple possession, property. You can see how Jesus keeps pushing it. The greater you want to be, the lower you got to go. You need to view yourself as a deacon, indeed as a slave. That's where true greatness is in the kingdom. It looks very different from the politics of this world. So we're working our way toward the bottom, as it were, of the social ladder in terms of our own designs for greatness. Jesus says if you do that, then you're modeling that which was modeled for you by the Son of Man, who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The universal vision of power in the ancient world was to be served. That was what you were trying to achieve, to get in a position where you were being served. That's probably what was in the mind of James and John. Jesus' design for us is to be servants. It's the move from the passive voice, be served, to the active voice, to serve. We come into this world being served. Infants don't serve anybody. They are only being served all the time. But hopefully the mark of maturity is when we gradually become less those who are being served and more those who are serving. And if it's true generally, how much more it is true in our life of faith. Jesus came to serve, to give his life as a ransom. We all understand ransom is a word uniquely associated with some kind of bondage. A kidnapper demands a ransom. In the ancient world, it was used to talk about payment for prisoners of war or slaves or debtors. The 3rd century theologian Origen, who had a rather fanciful imagination theologically, came up with an elaborate theory that Jesus gave his life as a ransom paid to Satan to redeem us. The church wisely decided that isn't quite getting at it. It certainly doesn't square with the New Testament idea that Jesus came to plunder the house of a strong man, not to pay him off, not to pay a ransom to this guy who was a usurper in the first place. Rather, it's been taken traditionally to be a ransom paid to God, because sin had put us in bondage. We were exposed to the wrath of God because a holy God cannot simply ignore sin. He can't simply pretend it didn't happen. His holiness, his justice demands that infractions of righteousness in his universe must be responded to righteously, and that means wrath. And Jesus came and stood in the target area of that wrath that we deserved, in that sense paid a ransom, not to Satan, but to his Father, to liberate us. Some people don't like that because it seems to picture God as a malicious God who's just grumpy and so on. And that is so far from the principle at the heart of this. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son to pay that ransom. This isn't a diabolical God who's in a bad mood and needs to be appeased by his. This is not it at all. This is the principle of justice itself, which must be preserved if God will be preserved, has to be satisfied. It's called the satisfaction view of the atonement. And it seems to be at least implied somewhat here. All right, how are we doing? We can just barely make it. This is the last story. And that was strike 2, right? Number 1, James and John. Number 2, the rest of the 10, they have to be corrected. Now we have this elegant story of the character known to us as Blind Bartimaeus. Now they came to Jericho. And as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Then many warned him to be quiet, but he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man and said, "Be of good cheer, rise, he's calling for you." And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus. So Jesus answered and said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabboni," that I may receive my sight. Then Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. Simple, wonderful, elegant story. It all takes place in Jericho. Luke tells us the story of Zacchaeus. Remember that? In Jericho, at the same time. Mark doesn't tell us that story. But Jesus is now exiting Jericho with his disciples, with a great multitude, and this character, blind Bartimaeus, is by the road begging. This is the second healing of a blind man in Mark's gospel. The first was the run-up to the Caesarea Philippi confession. It was a partial healing in the first instance there. I see men like trees walking, you remember that, and then the job was completed, probably anticipating the kind of half vision of Messiah that the disciples would have at Caesarea Philippi. But this one seems to be more a call to true discipleship. My friend Dr. Gary Kinney, who is a professor of biblical studies out at Eastern Washington, wrote a short commentary on Mark in which he makes the case that this is in fact a call to discipleship. Bartimaeus is the only healed person in Mark given a real name. Bartimaeus. Nobody else has a name. They're just people that show up and depart. We hear of Jairus, but it's his daughter who's healed. We don't know the name of the daughter. It suggests that Bartimaeus was known to the community to whom Mark was writing. Maybe a member of that community. Maybe they knew Bartimaeus. Who knows? But it seems that he had a reputation sufficient to justify using his personal name as if it would be a known quantity, suggesting he had become a disciple as a result of this encounter with Jesus. He addresses Jesus uniquely as Son of David. It's the only time the term is used in Mark's gospel. It was a term loaded with political significance. It was a controversial term that was charged with a kind of flavor of controversy and even of uprising. And it isn't used in Mark except here, and it suggests that this man, Bartimaeus, though he was blind, saw the truth of who Jesus was and is. And it was that caused him to make this call. He says that this is the last healing that's recorded by Mark. It's like the culminating moment. All of this, and maybe other factors as well, suggest to us that though the story is short and simple, there's a lot of that rich sense of being called to discipleship and to citizenship in this. They're in Jericho. Jericho is sometimes called the city of palms, famous for its palm trees. It was 17 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Mark tells us there's a great crowd. Luke agrees. There's a great crowd heading for Jerusalem for Passover, and also many of them expecting fireworks connected with this Jesus of Nazareth when they arrived there. All of this suggests it was a time of high tension, high momentum, and yet Jesus is willing to take time for a relative nobody who's sitting there at the side of the road calling out. So Bartimaeus starts as a kind of outsider but finishes on the road as an insider. Verse 47, when he, Bartimaeus, heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Two titles for Jesus in this verse: Jesus of Nazareth, Son of David. Jesus has not been called Jesus of Nazareth since chapter 1. In chapter 1, he was called that name by a demon calling Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. The sense of it is Jesus the Nazarite. It's a play on words. It's an intentional play on words. Because Nazareth and Nazarite were virtually the same, and it would be reminiscent of the most famous Nazarite in the Old Testament, whose name was Samson, who is the quintessential strong man of the Old Testament. And so this idea that Jesus is now, in a sense, the greater Samson, the greater Nazarite, the greater strong man, who is going to a house to plunder the goods of a strong man, a house that had become a den of thieves, is about to be busted up by King Jesus. He's going to go in, clean house, and change things. And this is that moment that he's been anticipating, when you can't plunder the goods of a strong man unless a stronger man comes along and does so. And Jesus, of course, this stronger Nazarite, Samson as it were, is coming. So he's plundering a house of a strong man, which is what is connected to his status as son of David. This is a very well-known and controversial term at that time. If you called someone son of David or used that term, that could be viewed even by the Romans as an incitement to some sort of violent overthrow. It was a word that had that kind of texture to it. And so taken together, what we have is this blind Bartimaeus who's seeing things pretty clearly and giving expression to them in a way that doesn't reflect any degree of shyness on his part. I love Jim Edwards' comment in passing on this. What Bartimaeus lacked in eyesight, he made up for with insight, you see. Even as a blind man at the side of the road, he got it more than others who might have been traveling along with him. Well, because of the controversial character of what he was saying, many warned him to be quiet. But it caused him to cry out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." They were warning him to be quiet, probably partly because he was just an annoyance. Didn't speak right, dress right, smell right, you know. Come on, man. Jesus got better things to do, more important stuff to do than waste time with you. But it may have also been fear of reprisals, because this man is shouting at the top of his lungs this very controversial, loaded term, son of David. They were fearful maybe, some of the Romans are going to come out of the woodwork and begin to create problems here. It didn't slow down blind Bartimaeus. The rebukes only provoked more and more appeals, reminding us of Jesus' comment in Matthew, "From the days of John the Baptist till now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence. The violent take it by force." In a sense, Bartimaeus is becoming, in some sense, a violent man. He's not going to be stopped. He is going to get this kingdom. He's going to get his day before Jesus. So Jesus stood still, commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man and said to him, and the sense of this is be something like, cheer up, or you're in luck, or something. It's a very kind of modest colloquialism. "Rise, he's calling for you." It's rather dramatic. Jesus stood stock still. He summons the one that the crowd had been trying to dismiss. He stops, one commentator said, for a blind beggar while en route to the most monumental event in human history. But he's got time for this little distraction. The phrase "cheer up" is more something like, "Okay, you win," just sort of that thing. And it's not the deeper "be of good cheer" that Jesus will sometimes say, although he would probably say something like that to Bartimaeus himself before we're done. Mark notes what almost seems just a unnecessary little side remark, but it's significant. He threw away his garment and rose and came to Jesus, throwing aside probably his most valuable possession. He's a beggar, and he has a garment that probably has some worth. But when it comes to the trade-off between a garment that might impede him and freedom from it that might give him access, he gets rid of the garment. Whoever leaves houses and brothers and sisters and whatever, and the garment that is your prized possession, whatever it takes to come to Jesus, seems to be Mark's point here. It's the heart of true conversion, casting aside valuables to obtain the most valuable thing, as in the treasure in the field. Well, Jesus answered and said to him, just as he had said to the two brothers, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, Rabboni, that I may receive my sight. Same question, different answer. James and John should have asked, Lord, that we can have some sight here. We've got some kind of misguided ideas. We need for you to open our eyes. They didn't ask for that. They thought they saw things clearly. Bartimaeus knew he didn't see anything clearly, and yet he saw more clearly, maybe, than the others. He uses this expression, Rabboni. It's very rare. It's taken from the Aramaic term that sounds roughly the same. Jim Edwards points out something that is, I think, really helpful here. It's a term that in ancient Jewish literature was seldom applied to humans at all, almost never applied as a personal address. It was not like rabbi or teacher. This was a word that had a very different feel to it. It was a word that was, however, frequently and indeed commonly used to address God in prayer. It would be virtually an affirmation of deity for Bartimaeus to come and say, Rabboni. It'd be tantamount to saying, you who are God himself, that you would do this for me. It's a powerful affirmation in Mark's gospel of, once again, someone recognizing Christ as nothing less than God among us. Jim Edwards says its use here suggests Bartimaeus and Mark's estimation of Jesus, that it was much more than just a political character or even a prophet or even a great man or miracle worker. Much more than even all of that is implied here. The last verse of this short text, Jesus said, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. Your faith has literally saved you. Sozo is the word there. He received his sight and followed Jesus. Teaching us, in a sense, only those whose eyes are open are capable of following Jesus. And the corollary, anyone whose eyes are open will inevitably follow Jesus. That is of the nature of having open eyes. In John's Gospel, of course, the famous text with Nicodemus, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Later in John's Gospel, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. But whoever the Father gives me will come to me, you see. There is that sense in which once the eyes are open, nothing will keep you away from Jesus. He becomes irresistible, and you will have him with open eyes. And it does seem to be what Bartimaeus is teaching us. Chrysostom says of Bartimaeus, he shows persistence to come to Jesus and gratitude to follow him. Interestingly, Jesus said to Bartimaeus, "Go." Rather, Bartimaeus disobeyed and came and followed Jesus in the way. So what do we learn from Bartimaeus? We learn that a true citizen seeks to see the world through Christ's power by seeing the blindness of a life without him. It's tempting for us to think we get it, but we don't really get it until we see it with the eyes of faith, which must come as a gift of God's grace. And then the world is a very different place, because we see not only what's in the morning newspaper, but we see a vastly more important agenda of the kingdom being worked out in history. A true citizen of the kingdom seeks to increase the glory of Christ by decreasing the glory of self, seeking indeed to become servant of all. That's the stuff of the kingdom. We're working to serve each other, to esteem others better than ourselves. This is the heart of the Christian ethic, to view others, even the least of these, as worthy of our greatest and most important efforts to champion their needs. This is what it's about to be a Christian. We learn a true citizen seeks to follow Christ only, regardless of cost, by abandoning any impediment, including a garment that may be valuable or anything else, for the sake of having him. It's a reprise of what we heard last week. It's a repetition of it, and maybe an emphasis on it as well.